Good evening, everybody. I welcome everyone, and I think now we can start. First, may I thank the speakers for taking part in this important event. I am Asma El Sony from Sudan, currently a member in the Asma Network and in the advisory board of non-communicable diseases, Geneva. Erol, please introduce yourself.
Hello, everybody. My name is Erol Gaillard, and I'm a respiratory pediatrician working in Leicester, United Kingdom.
Okay, thank you. Time allocated for this presentation, as you see, are 20 minutes for each speaker. And we will have a session at the end, after both talks for questions. And we encourage you, to use the live chat box to post your questions during both sessions. At the end of the session, maybe we can all put our cameras on for a group photo. This is a very important webinar, and we all witnessed, or at least heard, wherever we are, the more frequent and intense drought, storms, fires, heat waves, rising sea levels, and warming oceans that have, a devastating impact on nature and environment globally. The Europe and Central Asia region face increasing vulnerability to climate change as warmer temperatures and more violent weather patterns disrupt ecosystems. Again, climate change is an increasing threat to Africa and to Africans' health. The impact include higher temperatures, drought, changing rainfalls patterns, and increased climate variability. Business activities that led to water degradation and other adverse impacts are exacerbating the problem. A climate change worsens, a collapse of the natural ecosystem will harm humans and animals, destroy habitats, and wreak havoc on people's livelihood and communities. True, we need governments, business leaders, and policymakers to build an ecosystem that both provides economic benefits and support a sustainable climate. Nevertheless, climate crisis experienced, as you know, worldwide, and it underscores the need of the world to transition to greener products with lower global warming potential. Respiratory diseases, as you know, depend on the use of inhaled therapies, particularly asthma, but also other chronic diseases. The proposed European Union regulation of F-gases will have significant, implications to access to pressure metered dose inhalers, especially for young children. It is well described. This is well described that the current inhaler types, because they contain hydrofluoroalkyl propellants, have a high global warming potential. How phasing of HFC to new formulations using propellants with lower GWP is done thoughtfully so as not to leave any asthma child behind? And can lower income countries afford this? This webinar will discuss the current status of access to inhalers, a just and planned transition to inhalers of lower GWP, and implications of the Kigali Agreement on access to inhaled therapies, and discuss the inequalities this may create in the pediatric population, globally, in low-income countries and vulnerable populations. May I introduce Dr. Rahel Kibedi to present our presentation. Rahel Kibedi is a specialist in pediatric pulmonary and critical care, president of the Ethiopian Thoracic Society. Her research interest is lung function test in children and asthma. We welcome you, Dr. Rahel.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Asma, for a very generous welcoming and definitely helping us in covering some of my presentation in your introduction. Let me try to put it on slide. Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me to give this talk. I declare no conflict of interest related to this talk. Just to begin with some facts about climate change. Climate change refers to long-term shift in temperatures and weather patterns. It represents a massive threat to respiratory health by directly promoting or aggravating respiratory diseases or by increasing exposure to risk factors for respiratory diseases. Human activities like household fuel burning, industrial chimneys, traffic exhausts, power generation, open burning of waste, desert dust, and many other sources are the main drivers for climate change. By 2030 onward, climate change is expected to cause 250,000 deaths per year from malnutrition, malaria, diarrhea, and heat stress. 7 million premature deaths every year are due to air pollution. Climate change increases the amount of pollen and allergen production, concentration of outdoor ozone and particulate matter at ground level, and mold proliferation. The most important biological component of ambient air is pollen. Its allergen is driver for airborne allergic diseases. In fact, global warming affects the onset, duration, and intensity of the pollen season, as well as the allergenicity of the pollen. As for air pollution, industries, transport, and human activities are the major sources for air pollutants. Ozone, particulate matter, nitric oxide, carbon monoxide are considered with the occurrence of exacerbation of chronic respiratory diseases. Rising temperature will contribute to the elevation of concentration of ozone due to more sunlight and higher temperature, and particulate matter due to wildfire, droughts, desertification, sandstorms, and an increased use of coal-fired power to produce energy for cooling at ground level. A growing body of evidence shows that components of air pollution interact with airborne allergens and enhance risk of atopic sensitization and exacerbation of symptoms in sensitized subjects. Extreme weathers directly harm children through injury, death, increased risk of infection, and indirectly through devastation of social contexts. Every year, these disasters result in over 60,000 deaths, mainly in developing countries. Rising sea levels and increasingly extreme weather events will destroy homes, medical facilities, and other essential services. Increasingly variable rainfall patterns are likely to affect the supply of fresh water. Floods are also increasing in frequency and intensity, contaminating fresh water. Rising temperature, on the other hand, and variable precipitation are likely to decrease the production of staple food in many of the poorest regions. Consequently, the main diseases of concern resulting from these environmental exposures are asthma, rhinosinusitis, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and respiratory infection. Climate-related health emergencies are on the rise in Africa. In the last 20 years, out of 2021 public health events, it recorded 56% were climate-related. 28% of health emergencies were vector-borne. 78 million people in Africa face chronic hunger by 2050. Only a third of the finance required to tackle climate change is secured in Africa. So the effects of climate change on child health include physical, psychological sequelae of weather disasters, increased heat stress, decreased air quality, altered disease patterns of some climate-sensitive infections in food, water, and nutrient insecurity in vulnerable regions, and mental health effects of extreme weather events. Children living in low-middle countries are most affected. Increasing greenhouse gases secondary to fossil fuel consumptions, agriculture, and land degradation, industry processes are the main driver for this climate change. Indeed, extreme weather, altered rainfall, sea level rise, acidification of oceans, raised temperature are some of the problems. Limiting temperature rise to less than 2 degrees Celsius is required to avert these disastrous consequences. Studies have shown a unique vulnerability of children younger than 1 year old to heat-related mortality due to immaturity in thermoregulatory systems. Increased temperature is related to the rise in mortality, premature births, stillbirths, heat stroke, and increased hospitalization from respiratory diseases. Likewise, poor air quality, like ground-level ozone exposure, has been associated with asthma exacerbation, increased ED emergency visits, and pediatric ICU admissions for asthma, and increased risk of developing asthma. Exposures to wildfire smoke has been estimated to cause about approximately 500,000 global deaths annually. On the other hand, elevated counts and allergenicity to raised CO2 concentration led to occurrence and exacerbation of allergic disease globally. Prenatal exposure to air pollutants resulted in birth outcomes, adverse birth outcomes, increased risk for infection, and limited lung development. However, the mechanism for this is not fully understood. It's thought to be through a complex interplay of environmental and epigenetic factors involving both the direct effects of air pollution and on the placenta, resulting systemic inflammation in the mother. Furthermore, nanoparticles from air pollution may cause both developmental and epigenetic changes. Reports indicate that oxidative stress is increased and the antioxidant balance is tilted toward a pro-inflammatory state in chronic airway diseases such as asthma and COPD. Reports also state that inhaled ozone has a powerful oxidant capacity and that can activate stress signaling pathways in epithelial cells and resident alveolar inflammatory cells. On top of that, studies have suggested that air pollutants cause cell toxicity and modify the cell death and cell cycle of lung cells. Pollen grains or plant-derived micronic components may interact with air pollutants in producing respiratory symptoms, and also pollen production is increased in higher concentration of C2. It also influences allergenicity and also susceptibility. Individuals have risk of airway reactive despite this air pollution induced increased load of aero allergens. It's estimated that 88% of the existing global burden of disease attributable to climate change occurs in children younger than 5 years old in both industrial and developing countries. Immature physiology and metabolism make them more vulnerable to change induced by climate change. Exposure of pollutants to the maturing lung result in aberrant development with long effect in airway disease and reduced lung function. Their body habitus puts them at risk for higher exposure to air, food, and water pollutants. On the other hand, their unique behavior, like For instance, staying outdoor to play, hand-to-mouth behavior, staying with their mom while cooking puts them at risk for prolonged exposures. Furthermore, their dependence on caregivers is an additional risk if caregivers fail to timely respond to their needs. So what are the respiratory impacts? Reviews done to evaluate the impact of ambient air pollution on lung health in children living in sub-Saharan Africa indicated paucity of data on the subject. 80% of African children are known to be exposed to indoor pollutions. Growing number of studies also show that children living in environments near traffic have increased risk of asthma symptoms, asthma exacerbation, school absence, and asthma-related hospitalization, as well as new onset asthma. In terms of increased vulnerability due to higher air pollution exposures, a study done in 10 European cities, AFCOM study showed that the living near traffic roads is the cause of 15% of asthma in children. When we come to our setup, respiratory infection and acute respiratory symptoms are increasingly recognized as a health effect related to air pollutants. In Zimbabwean demographic and health survey data on children under the age of 5 years, exposure to high levels of biomass fuel in over 3,550 children was associated with a more than twofold risk of acute respiratory infection, the risk being in infants. In another study done in Cameroon, exposure to indoor air pollution was associated with approximately fourfold risk of developing an ARI or acute respiratory infections. Indoor air pollution has significant health effects with reported increase in cough, persistent cough, wheezy episodes, and acute respiratory infection, particularly in young children under the age of 5 years. This was well demonstrated in a study done in South African children involving children under the age of 26 months, found that odds ratio of about 4 of dry cough if living next to road with high tract density. A similar study in the same population conducted in school-aged children, 13 to 14 years of age, found an association between high tract traffic and current wheezing. On the other hand, air pollutants had an impact on on lung function too. The Drankestein Child Health Study, sorry if I have misspelled it, South African birth cohort study assessed the impact of prenatal exposures on infant lung functions at 6 weeks of age and found that the antenatal exposure to benzene altered lung function. From the same birth cohort, antenatal exposure to particulate matter and toluene were associated with both the development and severity of lower tract infection in infancy. A study done in Malawi on school-going children found that forced vital capacity Z-score in children with higher exposure households were lower, though with a small difference with borderline significance. A study done in Durban, South Africa, found that increasing and fluctuating level of nitric oxide or nitric dioxide level were associated with significant declines in forced expiratory volume in 1 second in school-going children. This was actually exaggerated in those children with hyperresponsive or persistent asthma. So the role of climate change related factors such as high temperature, temperature variability, humidity, and extreme weather events or respiratory infection morbidities are evidenced or derived by studies done in high-income countries. Ambient temperature is related to increase in allergic rhinitis by inducing increased production of pollen, by prolonging pollination time and increasing allergenicity when coupled with air pollutants. Studies indicate that cold weather resulted in increased infection rate in COPD and also in the number of bronchiolitis. Increased mortality and morbidity of asthma was also noticed with a higher temperature rise. So what are the challenge for Africa? You know, in Africa, in under 5-year-old children with asthma symptoms, over 90% were diagnosed with pneumonia and treated with antibiotics, thus missing opportunities to address the true underlying issue. So this, coupled with limited diagnostic capacity, we're sure that we are missing a significant portion of children affected by, you know, airway diseases like asthma. Studies of children and adults with asthma have reported a reluctance to admit to a diagnosis of asthma, even within families. Only about 60% of people with asthma have asthma medication in their home, and this is usually limited to salbutamol or prednisolone with inhaled treatment, only deemed necessary for those with the most severe diseases. So adherence is an issue. Preferably, they want to be using oral medications, and they have a significant fear of inhaled medications. So this has, you know, have been shown that we have a high burden in mortality and morbidity. Because of this, many studies show that a third of asthma patients on controller have poor control of asthma symptoms. The majority of symptomatic children were over-reliant on as required short beta agonists, and only 70% of asthmatics were on regular ICS control. So lack of organized health promotion programs, such as effective and controlled strategies for environmental triggers, air pollutants, and occupational deaths, have also contributed to the growing burden in Africa. Thus, through all these challenges, Africa willingly joined in the effort to reduce global warming. Among the numerous interventions, reducing chlorofluorocarbons level by hydrofluorocarbon, or HFC that I'm going to be calling it subsequently, is anticipated to slow down the rate of global warming. HFCs are intentionally made greenhouse gases that have no known natural sources. They are used in air conditioning, refrigeration, fire retardants, aerosols, and solvents as blowing agents in the foam sectors. The use of HFCs is growing steeply, primarily due to increase in the air conditioning and refrigeration sectors, and as a direct result of the phase out of ozone depleting substance, which are the CFCs. Their atmospheric lifetimes are on the order of few days to 50 years, with an average around of 15 years, 1.5, compared to carbon dioxide, which can stay for really hundreds of years and above. Replacing it can avoid as much as 0.5 degrees Celsius of warming of global climate system by 22nd century. However, it filters infrared waves much more powerfully, contributing to global warming to hundreds and thousands times compared to carbon. So,
I'm sorry, Rahel, I need to give you a 3-minute warning, please.
Yes, I finished actually. The Kigali Amendment is an international agreement to gradually reduce the consumption and production of HFCs. So high-income countries are committed to reducing the use of HFCs by 45% by 2024 and by 85% by 2036. And low-middle income countries are committed to reducing its consumption by 80% by 2045, but this has been the deadline has been extended due to various factors. So what is the impact for the respiratory medicine? 2/3 of all doses prescribed use pressure metered dose inhaler using high flow fluorocarbons. In 2019, 400 million packs prescribed, equating to 2,400 doses taken every second. In 2014, high hydrocarbon fluorocarbons, HFCs, emission from MDIs represented only 0.03% of annual global greenhouse gas emissions, contributing very much little amount in the global warming potential. So what are the implementation challenge for Africa? This is a very high price of the low, carbon footprint gases switch. In UK, the whole switch from using pressurized MDIs will be costing about 127 million pounds. The cost to the clients of such a switch will run into tens of billions of dollars, at least doubling the total cost of respiratory drugs. On top of that, children, elderly, some patients with chronic respiratory disease struggle to generate sufficient respiratory flows to get adequate delivery from the dry powder inhaled aerosols, which doesn't use HFCs. One review of the literature found values ranging between 19 and 78% of COPD patients are actually unable to generate 60, the peak inspiratory flow meter flow. So a systematic review published in Lancet Global Health indicated that countries in low middle income countries, only 10% meet the 80% availability target for short-acting beta agonists. 6% of the inhaled corticosteroid and very few for the combination drugs. SABA inhalers typically cost about 1 to 4 days wage. Inhaled corticosteroids 2 to 7 days of wage, and in the combination at least 6 days of wage. And even in some, in an Uganda study, the cost may be high as 17 days wage. Although Africa is keen in contributing to the global efforts to tackle climate change, given all the evidences I have presented so far, I would like to ask you, can Africa afford the switch to HFC to new formulation using propellants with lower global warming potential? This is a question to be entertained in your mind. In conclusion, climate change impact on respiratory disease is a global public health problem. Asthma, COPD, respiratory infection, allergic rhinitis are the main diseases. Access and affordability of inhaled drugs in low-middle countries are challenges. Emphasis have to be made to enhance access of new formulation using propellants to low-middle income countries, given that we have a very high budget deficit and access is very limited. Thank you.
Thank you, Rahel. Brilliant
Thank you very
presentation.
much,
and yeah, thank you for an excellent perspective. Can I remind everybody that if you have any questions to the presenters, please put them in the chat. And it now gives me great pleasure to introduce Professor Erik Melén from the Karolinska Institute in Stockholm, Sweden. Erik is a pediatric allergist and expert on asthma, allergies, and respiratory disease in children. And his research aims to explore long-term effects of early life exposures on allergic and respiratory disease. And so he's excellently placed to give the European perspective. Over to you, Erik.
Thanks, Erol. And it's really a pleasure to be invited to this ERS PATS seminar. Can you hear me well and see my slide?
Yes.
Excellent. So I'm here in Stockholm, Sweden. I'm a pediatric allergist, and so I'm a part-time clinician and part-time researcher, as Erol mentioned. I'm also a member of the ERS Environmental Health Committee. So I was asked to give a little bit of a European perspective, and some of what I will be talking about may overlap with Rahel, but I think that's only good news that we have a common view and a common approach to these complex problems. So here's my conflict of interest disclosure. I don't think it matters for this presentation. The outline is then I'll talk a little bit about air pollution and climate change. I also mentioned the children's exposure. Now, currently, the life course approach is very useful. I think also very handy in trying to understand the long-term consequences of exposure and disease. And we'll talk a little bit about beyond the air pollution exposure, allergen levels, and other outcomes such as meat allergy, mitigation, and what can we as healthcare professionals do about it, and also conclusion. So we've already mentioned the air pollution and the silent killer, and that's really, really important. And I just want to highlight, of course, the detrimental effects on deaths and mortality, but also the fact that children worldwide are breathing toxic air. And that goes for all countries, all around the world, even in Sweden, even in Stockholm, Sweden. So that's an important aspect. And also, I think now the new WHO global air quality guidelines are really in improvement, and we should really aim to achieve those recommendations, and that will save lives and save mobility. So this paper came out 2019 in the New England, and just highlighting air pollution and how air pollution and climate change are intertwined. So we know that the greenhouse gases and the air pollutants is strongly linked then to increased temperatures, extreme weathers, and weather conditions, and mold and flooding, etc. And that's good to keep in mind. I'll talk a little bit about the air pollution effects as we've experienced this and our data suggest here in Europe. The life course perspective, I think, is very important because it shows really how the developing child or the growing child, and in particular here, a pair of growing lungs, may be affected early in life by air pollutants from traffic, from industry. We have talked about, or Rahel nicely outlined, the global warming effects and those environmental exposures. Also what counts as microbial exposures, other species that we encounter. I'll talk about the pollen levels and how these factors all interact cumulatively in a growing child, and that may have also long-term consequences. This is a review that we published last year. It also brings up some of the epigenetics changes that are associated with environmental exposure, for instance, and also some of the allergies that are associated both with allergy, both with epigenetics and the exposure. We're not going to go into details about the epigenetics today, but I'm just mentioning that for the completeness here. But the life course perspective again, and here this is a schematic figure that shows lung function from childhood, here, birth, puberty, adulthood, and then decline. And the green line is the normal lung function. Here, the red curve is really the very high level of lung function. Those with the supernormal lung function. But look here are the children who somehow have a poor lung function growth early in life. And that's the children we should care about and we should focus. Why? Because they never reach their target peak maximum lung function. And it's also true that they will end up in a much lower lung function as adults. That will potentially put them at risk for COPD and for actually premature death. So Rahel nicely outlined also why children are peculiarly vulnerable to environmental hazards. Again, that goes globally, in India for this picture, or in Stockholm, Sweden, where I live. And I just want to highlight also beyond the narrow airways and immune system and development, that children typically don't choose their lifestyle. And I think this is very, very important. And we as caregivers and the healthcare professionals, we have a responsibility to make sure children will have as good environment as possible. So let's look at the air quality index again. I think this is a great web page. It can be accessed online for free, and this shows immediate air quality index across the globe. So I'm up here in Scandinavia, in Stockholm, where we currently have a decent air quality, absolutely. But we can see the red hotspots here in some Southern Europe, also India, Southeastern Asia, etc. Some of the African countries as well. And here is also a guide with very unhealthy air, for instance. So this is important, and it's some regions have indeed good air quality, others have a more challenge with higher air pollution levels, and that goes globally, and that goes as well for Europe. Now again, this is Sweden, we have Norway, so I'm here in Stockholm, and again we have reasonably good air quality here. This is Poland and Czech Republic, and some cities here and areas have a really higher challenge. So this is actually really useful, and please have a look at the World's Air Pollution Real-Time Air Quality Index if you like it. I mentioned the lung development here. So why is that important? Again, because if children end up in a low lung function, it will put them at risk of COPD or later disease. And here we're zooming in now. We know genetics is important. We know preterm birth, we know the early life exposure, and this is the focus, obviously, of today. I'm just mentioning also for completeness, the lower respiratory tract infections and the childhood persistent asthma. So here's a picture of my home city. This is Stockholm on a beautiful summer day or maybe early fall. But again, with a relatively clean air compared to many other cities, we can see that infants at 6 months of age, if they are exposed to particles or NO2 from traffic, it's also a reduction in their lung function. So we also can observe impaired lung function in infants already at the age of 6 months if they are exposed to levels in Stockholm, Sweden. So that's important, and again, it's global, it's happening as we speak. This is a study that we conducted a few years ago within the BAMSE project that I'm part of. It's a birth cohort, and we followed 4,000 kids, and they're now young adults. And then we looked at some of the outcomes in young adulthood: chronic bronchitis, 1 in 20, and irreversible airflow limitation, according to COPD criteria, occurred in 2%. And these conditions were also, they go hand in hand with cough, phlegm, and every symptoms, infections, etc. And also look here, we see again in Stockholm very strong links with air pollution exposure. And again, the early life exposure seemed to be quite important in the long-term health effects as young adults. So we can conclude that for a growing child, really the exposure early in life, air pollution, but also having infections and having asthma and cigarette smoke will have long-term consequences, and we can detect that already in young adulthood. And it's not just lung function. The pandemic has affected us all, and we can show that again. In Stockholm, we've seen with the short-term effects, so the higher levels around you, where you live, is actually linked to a higher risk of COVID infection and the SARS-CoV-2 virus. We've also just presented new data on long-term COVID or long COVID, meaning that the higher levels generally on long-term air pollution, the higher the risk of young adults getting a long COVID symptom after having the acute infection. So this is actually quite important data, we think, and again, this is from Stockholm, Sweden. So we talked about air pollution now and what we still detect in our studies. We'll move a little bit from the air pollution now to the global warming and the microbial exposures, etc. And it's also very clear that the global warming will have consequences for altered pollen seasons, spread of allergens, and in Sweden here, grass pollen allergy and birch pollen allergy are among the most common symptoms. Also, that goes hand in hand with altered biodiversity. And those things will have implications for the diagnostics, for the tests we are running to detect allergies. For the patient who may suffer from symptoms outside the regular season, And if they have an allergy or an allergic asthma, and all of a sudden they become symptomatic and they don't really know why, maybe because the pollen levels are very high that particular day. It may be new pollen species entering the area, and unless we're aware of it, we will miss those features. So here's a paper. It's actually from North America, but it goes very well. It's a PNAS paper, and I thought it was a very nice graphics and everything, showing that with annual temperature, there is a really clear-cut increase in the pollen levels. So the higher temperature, the higher pollen pollen levels. So that goes for the annual, and that goes for the spring season. And they were also able to show that the annual levels of certain grass and tree pollens really increased also over the years, and really that's also concerning. So we will be facing higher pollen levels. And the same we've seen in Europe, also in many of the airborne pollen, grass and tree pollens are also being increased in the last years. Interestingly, I found this paper, ragweed plants grown under elevated CO2, meaning climate change situations, would elicit stronger allergic lung inflammation. This is a mouse study, but it really also showed that, unfortunately, there's suggestive evidence that now with elevated CO2 and greenhouse gases and climate change, perhaps the inflammatory response will be actually worse, and the allergen can elicit a stronger pulmonary inflammation. So that's also something that we should keep in mind. You may have seen on the first slide that I talked about other species and ticks, and this is the tick lonely star, I think it's called, known is also perhaps in some other countries. But ticks are also present in our country, in many countries, and with a warmer climate and perhaps milder winters here in Sweden, we will have more ticks, and ticks spread diseases. It can be TBE, it can be Borrelia, Lyme disease, but in our case for allergy and asthma, it's actually interesting because a tick bite can induce an IgE reaction to alpha-gal. It's a carbohydrate in the tick that is also present in red meat. And then after the part of the regular sensitization and the allergic reaction, a patient may experience symptoms. It can be hives, rash, nausea, vomiting, diarrhea, cough, and urticaria. Now, it's been believed also, or noticed mostly in adults, but it's actually happening also in children. So with climate changes and more ticks and other species like that, we may see also new features of allergy and allergic reactions. So what can we do about it? How can we mitigate climate change effects? This paper just came out in the Lancet, and I was part of the writing group. And here we also really highlight that the carbon footprint of the inhalers, and Rahel mentioned all that, and I just want to highlight also that that goes everywhere, and every puff of salbutamol with the propellant, PM method dose inhaler, PMDI, is estimated to equivalent a mile travel in petrol car in terms of global warming. That was a very, very that was a piece of news for me. I didn't know that was kind of the effect that we were seeing, and one single puff of an inhaler can give that effect. So it's really important that together we can try to do our best here. And how can we go about this? So I'm listing a couple of things here that we could do if we have, and if we want, and if you have the ambition to really mitigate climate change. So we should acknowledge that these climate change and the environments influence our patients and the global society, and discuss that with patients and also the children. Children are, as of today, are very aware of these matters. So we should keep educating each other. And the seminar today, hopefully, is a good example of that and the impact of climate change. We should obviously protect the vulnerable population, and children are one of them, but in particular, those with a severe disease. We should try to promote climate-friendly activities and lifestyle if we can. It's tough, but let's do our best. We should raise awareness of the climate change and boost the international policy. How can we go about this? And we should really also engage in also the policies globally and nationally and locally. research, of course, interdisciplinary primarily, and we can also try our best to reduce the greenhouse gases. And again, we should, if we can, use the powder DPI instead of the PMI and MDIs. And in Sweden and in Europe, I know we aim to provide the DPI from the age of 5 to 6 years, depending on the child, of course, and whenever possible. And especially in mild to moderate asthma, we use as much power inhalers as possible, and also strive for optimal asthma control and minimize the short-acting beta overuse. And I'm mentioning here again, every puff counts. Now, not everything is getting worse. Actually, we just had this news from Stockholm that children's lung capacity improved in cleaner air. So we've seen now improved air quality, so better air quality in the last 20 years, and that went hand in hand with improved lung function. So we can obtain a better situation. And this was a paper that just came out in the ERJ, and we were very, very glad to see that with improvement in exposure, we were also able to show that the lungs of the children grew even better. So if I come to a conclusion now, air pollution, exposure, and climate change, they're strongly linked. We know that they go hand in hand. And we see the effects associated with respiratory health across the life course. And children are vulnerable and also will have a lifetime perspective of their lung function and lung health. And we talked about that, development, asthma, infections. Climate change certainly will alter biodiversity, pollen levels, exposures, etc. And now it's time to act, and we can achieve risk mitigation if we work hard and if we do it together. So with that, I thank you for your attention. I'd be happy to take questions.
Really fascinating, Erik. Thank you very much for this excellent talk. I'm now going to throw these up to the participants. I've got 2 questions in the chat. One, I think the first one is for Rahel. And it asks whether certain infections are more prevalent in Africa due to climate change.
Thank you for the question. Climate change may alter the incidence and severity of respiratory infections by affecting vectors and the host-immune responses. Actually, vector-borne infections like malaria is said to be going to be increasing significantly in a temperate climate in Africa as well. The other major culprits or pathogens that are going to be of great impact are actually the GI pathogens causing increased disease morbidity and mortality for the diarrheal diseases. E. coli, salmonellas, and the likes are implemented in this endeavor, and then it's because of this high rise of temperature, inducing their survival in the environment. The others are, as you know, that these floods may also enhance the fungal infections, particularly coccidioidomycosis, maybe one of the encountered pathogens, and even aspergillosis molds are also getting a good environment to proliferate. You may be asking, in Africa, prevalence, in mortality secondary to pneumonia are said to be increasing due to climate change. It's not yet for sure, but it has been known that there is increased risk of tuberculosis due to climate change. A systematic review have indicated that, but further exploration need to be done on these subjects. So, climate change definitely has an impact in infection, and definitely the burden will be higher in low medium income countries like ours, where the impact is said to be a little bit higher because we don't have a good mitigating plans and a good finance support, even for diagnosis and treatment. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much, Rahel. The next question will be for Erik, and it's a question in the BAMSI study where the pulmonary function effect from the PM2.5 or PM10, the question is whether this was sustained into adolescence.
Thank you. It's a very good question, and the interesting thing is, yes, it was particularly lung function growth between school age and up to young adulthood, meaning roughly around the age of 24, 25. So that we can really see that the lungs function improved with age and all the way up to adulthood. But fair enough, there was the growth or the change was more in this from school age to adolescence, but still there's room for improvement also after adolescence.
Thank you. Maybe if I could quickly slip in a question of my own. In studies on lung function and air pollution, what do you think the confounding effect of poverty is? Because presumably in Sweden, like in the UK, the poorest families with many other factors influencing lung function in their children, they live also in so the poorest live in the most polluted areas. And how important do you think that confounder is?
It's a really good question. I think we should not underestimate the influence of poverty and social determinants. We know, I think primarily that can go also with recurrent infections. So that is, we know that hurts the lungs, and it was a Lancet paper also that actually shown also there's a link to even the risk of premature death in adulthood. So I think the infections, the other exposures, such as tobacco smoking and the dietary factors, physical activity, the homes, mold, etc., and also the chemical exposures. I think being exposed to chemical agents is also not really healthy for anyone, and in particular not for children.
Brilliant, thank you. There is a question in the chat whether nebulizers would have less of an impact than metered dose inhalers.
I would assume so, yes. Myself not an expert in the different device, but yes, and Erol, you have to correct me if I'm wrong here, but that is something, it's another mechanism, right? So it doesn't rely on the propellant, so I would assume yes.
So nebulizers probably potentially would be healthier, although they may have other effects. Rahel, what's your thoughts on this?
Yes, nebulizers have actually, for the younger children, have better depositions, and they use mist and not that much of hydrofluorocarbons. So it's less risk in global warming potential, but still can have other adverse health effects, but as not directly related to the climate change. Thank you.
Thank you. I have another quick question for Rahel, and it's maybe slightly political question. Do you think the pharmaceutical industry should do more to support affordable, eco-friendly devices for the African continent or poor countries, in fact, in general? And I wonder whether you think Western rich countries should put more pressure on pharmaceutical industries, for example, through contracts to say, we're not going to support your product unless you make these things affordable for poorer countries.
Thank you. I think that the pressure on pharmaceuticals should be done in general to minimize costs for inhaled medication for low median income countries, not directly concerned to this climate change impact, because I see it as it contributes a little for the global warming potential, where we have many other industrial use of propellants that could be reduced and have a greater impact in the global warming potential. So for me, maybe, you know, in the future, the pharmaceuticals will be actually forced to switch to more affordable, you know, propellants because of high cost of production. But I don't think it's a current priority for Africa, at least, because we access for the normal, you know, pressure method dose inhalers, even for the combined inhaler drugs, it's quite a problem. So it's better to focus in actually making the pressure MDIs and all especially the corticosteroids available to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I realize we're out of time. I have one very quick answer question. Are the lungs of preterm infants more susceptible to pollution?
I would assume so, yes. But I haven't seen a lot of studies, but we know that the lungs of the children born preterm are sensitive and vulnerable. So I would assume yes.
Thank you. Right, we're out of time. Before we draw to a close, I would like to remind the audience that there is another PATS ERS webinar on the 13th of April, and this will be on the topic of respiratory care for the newborn in resource-limited settings. So please note that in your diary, and I hope we get a big attendance. But I would like to thank two excellent speakers today, Rahel Argaw and Erik Melén, and thank you very much for a fascinating topic presentation, and thank you to the audience for participating, and I wish you a very good rest of the day. Thank you all.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Right.
Thank you. Bye-bye.